I'd like to thank M&T Bank for their premier sponsorship of this program, as well as our signature sponsors, First Republic Bank and Kasner and Edwards. If you are attending an MHS program for the first time this evening, I want to give you a special welcome. We are an independent, nonprofit organization that maintains an amazing research collection of over 14 million manuscript pages and counting. We hold the papers of U.S. presidents, as well as philanthropists and factory workers, and even political radicals, which you're hearing about tonight. For the past 230 years, we have been making our unparalleled collection available for free to researchers, university faculty, students, and everybody. We also host a wide variety of programs, and this fall we have some great things planned. Now, we are only able to provide access to our collections and host programs like these with the support of our members and donors. We hope that you will return in person or online for future events, and that you'll support our work by becoming a member. So, this evening, we have a wonderful program that is both part of our public program series and part of our New England biography series. Our interlocutor, Megan Marshall, is part of the planning committee for the biography series, and we thank her for her service. We'll be learning about a new biography of Lydia Maria Child, a prolific, famous female author who is best known for her poem, Over the River and Through the Wood. However, in 1833, Child shocked her readers by publishing the first book-length argument against slavery in the United States, a book so radical in its commitment to abolition that friends abandoned her and her book sales plummeted. Yet, Child soon became one of the most foremost authors and activists of her generation. We'll be led through this fascinating American story by Lydia Moland, the author of Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life. Dr. Moland is a professor of philosophy at Colby College. She teaches courses on moral philosophy, aesthetics, and the history of modern philosophy. Her early career focused on 19th century German philosophy, but by 2017, I'm going to say she got converted, if I can use that sort of religious term, to American history, and particularly women's thoughts. And that's where she discovered Lydia Maria Child. Dr. Moland will be joined in conversation by one of the premier biographers in America, Dr. Megan Marshall. Dr. Marshall teaches nonfiction writing and archival research in the MFA Creative Writing program at Emerson College. She has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. She is the author of award-winning biographies, including Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, which explored the life and work of another American radical, and was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in biography. Please join me in welcoming these two distinguished Americans.
Thank you all so much for being here. What an honor to get to address you in this wonderful room where Charles Sumner is presiding from the back. He was one of the people, as you'll hear, with whose life, Child's life, coincided. So thank you so much to the MHS for hosting this and for their help with my research in writing this book, and especially for the use of many images from their amazing collection of American abolitionists, many of which are reproduced in this volume. It's been such a joy to work with them. They're such professionals and so helpful in every way. I also want to thank one person who is in person here tonight, without whom this book would not have happened, and that is my friend and fellow philosopher, John Cagg. John and I had what was for me a life-changing conversation in early 2017, right after I had discovered Child, and I was saying very earnestly to John something like, I think I'm going to write an academic article about her. And John said, no, no, no. You have a much bigger story here. I always do what John tells me to do, so John, here it is, and thank you so much for everything that you've done to help me get this book into the world. I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 3 of my biography of Lydia Maria Child, so I want to give you a little bit of background of what leads up to this moment that I want to read about. And part of that is about Child's early life, obviously. And before I do that, I just want to say that one of the things that makes it such an honor for me to be in conversation with Megan Marshall, is that Child knew and interacted with both Margaret Fuller and the Peabody sisters in really fascinating, wonderful ways. They didn't always agree, they didn't always approach things the same way, but they were part of the same intellectually rich environment that was Boston in the 19th century. Margaret Fuller and Child had a little study group as very young adults in which they read John Locke and Germain de Staël, and we were just saying earlier what a joy it would have been to be a fly on the wall for those conversations. So I've learned so much from Megan's book. She's been such a model for me in so many ways, and so again, it's just an honor to be here with you. So Lydia Maria Child was born in 1802 in Medford, Massachusetts. Her father was a baker. Her parents did not value education, especially for girls, but she had an older brother whose name was Converse, and I'll say something brief about him in this reading, who loved books. And he and she, his little sister, had what they called a secret society in his room above the bakery. And so he would come home from school and she would rush up and they would start talking about Milton and Shakespeare together. He was so bookish that the family doctor finally told his father that there was no point in trying to get him to take over the family bakery. So they did the next best thing, they sent him to Harvard. So he then went on to be a divinity professor at Harvard, actually. And then, she was a prodigious reader, and then she turned into a prodigious writer. So by the time she was in her mid-20s, she had published 2 novels, a volume of children's stories. She was editing something called the Juvenile Miscellany, which was one of the first periodicals for children in the United States, which was a wonderful combination of poems and games and riddles and stories. It was the sort of thing that children well into adulthood remembered waiting for and sharing with their fellow children. And then in 1829, she published something called The Frugal Housewife, dedicated to those who are not ashamed of economy. And it was one of the United States' first cookbooks, and it was also a kind of pioneering book in the self-help genre. Long story short, by the time she was in her late 20s, she was a beloved and trusted female author, and this was almost unheard of in the early 19th century. She was also financially very successful. So that brings us up to essentially where I want to start with one other detail I want to sketch out quickly, which was that the man you're about to meet, William Lloyd Garrison, was, as many of you know, one of the most important white abolitionists in Boston. I'm going to start with the moment that she meets him, but I just want to say also that William Lloyd Garrison came to Boston in part because of the thriving Black abolitionist culture here. So in 1829, David Walker, who was a Black Bostonian, had published something that was also called An Appeal, which Child called her book as well, that was a denunciation of the United States hypocrisy, both religious and political. And there were also people like Maria Stewart, who was one of the first women abolitionists, also a Black woman, to speak to mixed audiences, and also people like Prince Hall and Thomas Paul, many of whom lived in what is now the North End. So when William Lloyd Garrison arrived here, he was building on that foundation and owed the Black community a lot of what made his publication, which was called The Liberator, successful. So I'm going to skip around a little bit in chapter 3. I hope it makes sense, and I will start here. In 1830, a man arrived in Boston who would change Child's life forever. William Lloyd Garrison was a tall, thin, bespectacled editor, just a few years younger than Child. He had recently moved to Boston, fresh from his own stint in jail, after he had accused a powerful Massachusetts merchant of profiting from the slave trade and was convinced of libel. After his release, he did something even more radical. He read David Walker's appeal, and he listened to the Black community's passionate arguments against colonization. He was an unapologetic abolitionist, and he was spoiling for a fight. In 1830, it was still true that to be an abolitionist, to argue for the immediate and complete emancipation of enslaved people without compensation to their enslavers, was to be a radical. Garrison embraced the role wholeheartedly and in print. He had come to Boston to start a newspaper devoted to immediate emancipation. He would call it the liberator. As he bartered for ink and borrowed money to buy paper, Garrison also looked for recruits, people who could help spread the gospel of abolition. He knew of Child's work. He had already praised her as possessing a genius as versatile as it was brilliant and as being equal in wit and wisdom to Benjamin Franklin himself. He knew she was a talented novelist with a bent towards social justice. He knew she was capable of giving readers practical advice on how to change their lives. Maybe she would write for him. First, she would have to become an abolitionist. Soon after arriving in Boston, Garrison proposed that they meet. Decades later, Child still remembered Garrison's effect. I was then all absorbed in poetry and painting, soaring aloft on psyche wings into the ethereal regions of mysticism. Garrison got hold of the strings of my conscience and pulled me into reforms. It is no use to imagine what might have been if I had never met him. Old dreams vanished, old associates departed, and all things became new. I could not otherwise, so help me God. The walk from the modest rooms she and David now rented to her publisher's office still wound through the same uneven, crowded streets. Couples still promenaded through Boston Common, arm in arm. Her publishing deadlines still loomed, but everything was framed by new questions. Some were large and theoretical. Was slavery a moral problem or a political problem? Whose problem was it, the North's or the South's? Then there was her career. Writing fiction while actual human tragedy gripped the South suddenly seemed frivolous. Publishing parenting manuals while masters raped their slaves and sold their own children felt grotesque. All things became new. In the midst of such anguish, remorse, exhilaration, resolve, and fear, it can be hard to know what to do next. To orient herself in her new moral landscape, Child turned to what she knew best: books. For the next 3 years, as she continued to live in a city that boasted all the trappings of power the young United States could muster, she immersed herself in the history, economics, and politics of her country's ongoing sin. Soon it became clear what Child had to offer the cause: her reputation. She had established herself as a reliable source of homey but aspirational advice. Her readers knew her to be frank but compassionate. But would they trust her through a transition from house cleaning tips to abolishing slavery? Would they follow her from treating dysentery to curing the disease at their country's core? Was it true, as she had written to her sister, that they would always follow her, whatever she wrote? I imagined Child, perhaps at her kitchen table, searching for her book's first sentences. Perhaps she thought again of the powerful men she passed every day on the street, men whose arguments she knew and whose power she no longer feared. Reader, I beseech you not to throw down this volume as soon as you have glanced at the title, she wrote, her handwriting graceful and even. Read it, if your prejudices will allow, for the very truth's sake. She thought of the women who cooked from her recipes and read her stories to their children. If I have the most trifling claims upon your goodwill for an hour's amusement to yourself or benefit to your children, she wrote, read it for my sake. I imagine her looking around her frugal home, then turning back to her paper. Read it, she wrote, from sheer curiosity to see what a woman who had much better attend to her household concerns will say upon such a subject. So what did that woman say? Several chapters later, as she honed in on her closing arguments, Child took aim at one more target: her own hometown. While we bestow our earnest disapprobation on the system of slavery, her final chapter begins, let us not flatter ourselves that we are in reality any better than our brethren of the South. True, slavery had been outlawed here, but the very spirit of the hateful and mischievous thing is here in all its strength, she wrote. She herself had witnessed Black Americans in Boston being denied hotel rooms, chased from pews by indignant parishioners, blocked from trades by jealous workmen. She recalled racial slights in the halls of power and racial slurs in the street. Worse still, Northerners write and speak, she wrote, as if the prejudice against skins darker colored than our own was a fixed and unalterable law of our nature. It was another bad argument, and Child was not having it. The truth, she reported, was bleaker. "We made slavery," she wrote, "and slavery makes the prejudice." Sometime early in 1833, Child left the small house in Roxbury where she and David, after another move, had settled, and made her way to the city. With her, she carried a manuscript titled "An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans." As the printers laid out her text and inserted her images, what she was risking became ever clearer. In the appeal, Child was attacking her nation's economy, threatening its unity, and defying its religious leaders. She was calling her politicians hypocrites and her neighbors racists. The audacity of the appeal's every page was exacerbated by the fact that its author was a woman. As she checked her manuscript one last time, did she wonder if she'd gone too far? The backlash that followed the appeal's publication likely surpassed Child's most pessimistic predictions. The British reformer Harriet Martineau described Child as a lady of whom society was exceedingly proud before she published her appeal, and to whom society has been exceedingly contemptuous ever since. Other rebukes were more personal. Some friends publicly denounced her, others quietly avoided her. One Bostonian proudly refused to read the appeal because he feared it would make him an abolitionist. Another threw the book out the window with a pair of tongs. I think what must have hurt most was the juvenile miscellany, from which Child was forced to resign in 1834 after angry parents canceled their subscriptions in droves. The Child's financial situation was now dire, and now Child had sacrificed the literary reputation that might have saved them. Things would get worse before they got better. Soon, anti-abolitionist mobs would rage from Pennsylvania to Maine. Child would find herself shielding abolitionist speakers with her body, spiriting them out of the city, and hiding them in safe houses. Through it all, neither she nor her husband would make enough money to keep them solvent. And yet violence and poverty would not be the greatest challenges to her conversion. She could not have known this, but the end of slavery was still 3 decades away. Nothing threatens a conversion like delayed change. Life gets in the way. Old habits get in the way. Failure, discouragement, and defeat get in the way. Never living life the same way, it turns out, would be the challenge of Lydia Maria Child's life. I imagine a genteel Boston dinner party at which Converse Francis, Child's beloved brother, is asked awkward questions about his sister's new book. He answers as best he can. He returns home to his vast library, now among the largest in greater Boston, paralyzed by soul searching. Had he indeed gone wrong in cultivating a young girl's intellect, just as his parents had worried? He wrote her a letter, which is now lost, but Child's response conjures its admonishing tone. "You ask me to be prudent, and I will be so," she concedes. But, she quickly warns, it is too late for what the world calls prudent. "I have examined the cause of the slave too thoroughly and felt his wrongs too deeply to be prudent in the worldly sense of the term," she wrote. I imagine Converse Francis reading the letter, then closing his eyes, head in his hands. I imagine tearful children being told that they will no longer be receiving the juvenile miscellany since their beloved editor had turned out to be a dangerous radical. But while their less tolerant parents were not looking, trusting perhaps too easily in a familiar author, the damage had been done. I well remember an early reader of the miscellany wrote to Child decades later the zeal with which it was circulated by a little group of schoolgirl abolitionists, of which I had the honor to be one. We can only imagine what rippling effect those schoolgirls had on their society as they grew to adulthood and raised children of their own. Other effects of Child's efforts we do not need to conjecture. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, one of the financiers of John Brown's bloody abolitionist insurrection 25 years later, gave Child credit for his youthful conversion to anti-slavery work. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, too, cited Child's influence in starting him down the road of passionate abolitionism that would lead, decades later, to his being beaten unconscious on the Senate floor. And what of the proud Bostonian who refused to read the appeal, fearing that it would make him an abolitionist? He was a respected minister whose income depended on keeping his wealthy congregation happy. His wife and daughter had been converted by Child's arguments. I imagine them emboldened by the appeal's female author. I envision the minister harried by anti-slavery arguments as he sits at dinner, pursued by evidence of racial equality as he tries to escape to his bedchamber. How many more people among Boston's polite society sat at dinner parties, hearing their hosts rage at Mrs. Child's audacity, wondering to themselves whether she was right? Among the outraged parents who canceled their subscriptions to the juvenile miscellany, how many had second thoughts? We will never know, and Child never did either, but people do not throw ineffective books out of windows with tongs. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, for that wonderful reading, which really gives you such a strong sense of the power of her book, which is a contemporary echo of the power of Lydia Maria Child's book. So thank you. Before we get to some more complicated questions, you and your subject are both named Lydia, but are you really? Can you tell us about the first name that Lydia Maria Child preferred and how we know that?
Yes, so Child didn't like the name Lydia. I try not to take that personally, but it is true. It served me very well. My parents are here this evening. They gave it to me, and I thank them for that. But Child herself had bad connotations with it. She didn't say exactly who, but there must have been a kind of evil Lydia in her life. And so as a young adult, she took a new middle name. She wasn't given the middle name Mariah. She took it, and she asked to be called by it. So for the rest of her life, she signed her name L. Maria Child and asked her friends to call her Mariah.
Well, a little like R. Waldo Emerson.
That's right. No, it was and I
but,
think...
But it was her own name. She chose it.
It was.
Well, I think there's a real tradition of people remaking themselves by renaming themselves. Great Nathaniel Hawthorne added an E to the Hawthorne, so she's part of that.
Yes, and Margaret Fuller didn't start out being called Margaret either, did she?
No,
That's
that was
right.
her middle name,
That's right.
S. Margaret. So, so you talked about Child's conversion to abolitionism. Can you tell us about your own conversion to Child? How did you come to the subject?
Yes, it was a wonderful serendipitous moment of luck, really. In the wake of the 2016 election, I'd been happily doing German philosophy for my whole career, and I thought, it's time for me to come home to my own history, learn about my own history more. And also, I wanted to write something about women. And I had this vague memory that women had been important voices in the abolitionist movement, but I didn't know who or how. But I had this intuition that you couldn't fight an entrenched evil without thinking philosophically, without asking big questions like, what is justice? What is equality? What does it mean to be human? And you would have to be a good arguer too. And for better or for worse, philosophers are often good at arguing. So I went to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe at Harvard and asked to be shown some letters by female abolitionists. And I had a box of letters. There were several names that I recognized. And I came across one letter that just electrified me. It was clearly written from one activist to another. It had to do with whether the author was going to join in a particular kind of protest or not. It was funny. It was self-deprecating. The handwriting was beautiful. And it was at a moment when I think I and many of us were just grappling with how to engage. It was a moment where we were being asked to sign this protest and march in this protest and do any number of things, and it was just hard to get your moral bearings. And here was clearly someone who had a lifetime of experience doing that. So I got to the end of the letter. It was signed L. Maria Child. I had to look her up, and what I saw just floored me. I couldn't believe I'd never heard of her. I couldn't believe how much she'd done, and she spoke to me in a way that was just so clearly someone who's passionate about her country, saw that it was in a moral emergency, was taking stock of her capacities, her strengths, and her skills, and was going to dedicate all of them to trying to right her country's wrongs at whatever personal expense that came.
Well, that's a wonderful story. That's a great story about archives.
It
and
is,
the power
yes.
of those manuscript letters, which, you know, has taken me over as well. So something you and I have in common is that we've both written biographies of activist women who have been the subject of previous biographies, some of them really very good ones. There's Carolyn Karcher's and Deborah Clifford's biographies of Child that were published in the early 1990s, and you know, I think in many ways they've stood the test of time. So I'm wondering, you know, with your book 30 years later, were you correcting or updating or reframing the narrative? What was your thought about how to place your book in
Yes,
the
thank you.
procession of biographies of Child?
Yeah, I was so lucky that there were these two wonderful biographies in the 90s, both Deborah Clifford and Carolyn Karcher, who had really done the hard work of combing through mostly pre-internet journals and newspapers and letters. And for a while, Child's letters hadn't been collected, and so there was all of that work that had to be done as well. So they provided a wonderful foundation for me. But I wanted to come at her life as a philosopher with philosophical questions and looking for someone who could help me think about my own life and my own position as a white woman in the 21st century. And I wanted to use her life to invite other people to think along with me on those kinds of questions about collective responsibility, or what it means to try to balance the love for your family with the love of your country, or the sufferings of your family with the sufferings of enslaved people in another part of the world. How do you make your way as a moral subject through those kinds of conundrums? These are things that I teach in my moral philosophy classes all the time. And so I wanted to bring that perspective, I guess, to her life, because I felt like there was so much more to say about that aspect of her life. And it's been a wonderful experience for me to try to use her very specific things that happened to her to explore these more abstract questions.
That's wonderful. I was going to ask a question that in some ways you've already answered, but I'll try it all the same, which is really a question about the function of biography, what it does for readers as well as for the writers of biography. Walter Jackson Bate, who was the great biographer of Keats and Shelley, wrote a book kind of about his work as a biographer called The Burden of the Past, and he speaks of the value of linking ourselves imaginatively with the great figures of the past, which allows us, he says, to become freer to be ourselves, to be what we most want and value. So I'm wondering, you know, historians sometimes, some historians will say, this is, you know, not something we can really do. People in the past are different. It's just, you know, they're not the same. But maybe as a philosopher, you have a different sense that there's some, you know, universal humanity that we can find by looking to the past.
Yes, and I think it's not always, it's not the way most biographers approach their subjects, and that's fine. But to me, it felt really important to do that both in this moment in our country's history and also with this particular figure. So I don't think every figure would lend themselves to the kind of biography that I wanted to write. But it feels to me like I felt okay taking that perspective because I'm very upfront about it. In the prologue, I'm very clear that I'm going to use her life to ask questions about my own moral way in the world, and also that I want us to learn lessons from the kinds of problems that she faced. So I agree that we need to be careful not to assume that people in the past are exactly like us. But some of the problems that they faced are very similar, and we inherit those problems in ways that form the kinds of people that we are. So it felt as long as I signal to people, here's a point where I'm going to turn away from recounting the facts about her life and the research that I've done about her life, to thinking about what can we learn from this? What kind of terms or examples do philosophers use to talk about this kind of moment in somebody's life? That I could still let her speak in her own words, but use her life as a kind of mirror for us to think about our world today.
Well, I think, within the discipline of history, there's also a great deal of debate about this. Should history be used as advocacy, or is there some way we can be dispassionate and just, give the facts? And did you wrestle with that as you were writing this book? When did you decide it was all right to sort of step in and ask those questions? I can't say, bend the story, but, Child did many things in her life, but lives, almost. But you focused primarily on the political advocacy and the example that would give us today.
Yeah, and I think part of any biographer's work is picking and choosing what you want to emphasize and what kind of greater arc you want to build. And so I guess what I'd say, what I tried to do is choose the parts of her life that I felt in a way were most surprising to me, that I had been ignorant of in my own history, in my own country's history, I mean. And so I wouldn't say that I was from a position of advocacy trying to convince people of one thing or another, but I did choose to emphasize or to write more extensively about some parts of her life because they are so important, I think, to understanding the way the 19th century informs our lives. So just to give you a couple of examples, I knew nothing about these anti-abolitionist mobs that raged up and down the East Coast in the North. And so I'm sure some biographers might not have emphasized them as much or not explained as much about them as I do here. But I think that's such an important moment for us, especially those of us who live in this part of the country, to be reminded that there was vicious opposition to abolitionism in Boston and in all of the places that we know and love in this area. And so, and also I could name a couple of other parts of her life that I really wanted to foreground because I felt like it allowed me to tell parts of our story that, since I was ignorant of, I assumed that some other people might be ignorant of as well.
I think that's reasonable. So in recent years, there's been also a critique of the white abolitionists as not fully accepting of the humanity of the black men and women they meant to help. In her recent book about the Grimke family, Carrie Greenidge writes that the often lionized abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke, along with Garrison and Weld, were more capable of extending sympathy to the victims of slavery than of working alongside free black abolitionists as equals. How did you find Maria Child in this way? And maybe you can tell a little bit about her work with Harriet Jacobs on her narrative.
Yes. Yeah, and I really recommend Carrie Greenidge's biography of the Grimkes. I think this is a really important part of the record for all of us to grapple with, that within the abolitionist movement, and this Linda Hirschman also wrote a very good biography of Maria Weston Chapman and Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison last year that showed a lot of, quite simply, the racism that was within the abolitionist movement. So I think it's important for us to realize that it was entirely possible for a white person in Boston, for instance, to be against slavery, but not to think of black people as their equal. So not want them to be enslaved, but also not want them in their churches or their stagecoaches or their schools. And so there was a lot of that within the abolitionist movement, and people could feel very self-righteous about throwing themselves at ending a problem that was somewhere else without wanting to look at the way the problem was instantiated in their own lives. So there was a lot of that in the abolitionist movement, and Child was certainly complicit in it in some ways. I think in some ways she was better than some of the people that I just mentioned, but there's no question that there were a couple of things she was committed to that were very, I think, problematic. One was respectability. So she was convinced, well, I wouldn't even quite say that. She would write to black audiences. She wrote a couple of books specifically for black readers, that if they just dressed nicely, talked softly, didn't act out, had nice houses, were respectable, that white people would lose their prejudice. Which, if you just think about it, puts an unbearable burden on people who are already struggling horrific discrimination, right? So yes, you're suffering this horrific discrimination, but if you just behave a little better, it would go away. And she also knew that wasn't often true. Like, she knew that it was sometimes exactly the cases in which Black people started schools and businesses and got involved in politics that their white neighbors would get even more enraged. So we know that many of the race massacres in Reconstruction especially were reflections of that. So I think that there's a really important tension for people like me to learn about there, that it's very problematic for a white person like myself, on the one hand, to wring my hands about racial injustice, and on the other hand, try to convince people that it doesn't exist. So I think she fell into that trap a couple of times. The story about Harriet Jacobs is such a fascinating story. So for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure many of you do, Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in North Carolina. She escaped as a young woman. She was living in the North. She wrote a memoir of her enslavement, and this was during a time that many people like Frederick Douglass were writing slave narratives, but there were very few, if any, by women. So this was a huge risk. It also told a horrific story of sexual harassment and abuse, and so it was very hard for her to find a publisher. She finally found a publisher who said, "We will publish this book if you get an introduction from Lydia Maria Child," as a way of sort of vetting it. So Jacobs approached Child, and Child agreed to do that. They became really good friends. They had a long and wonderful friendship, actually. Child agreed not only to write the introduction, but essentially to be the editor of this manuscript. Now, it's not clear Jacobs wanted an editor. So Child gave her all kinds of advice, and we don't know whether whether she agreed with the advice, and if she felt like she had any power to fight back, or just to disagree, right? There was a huge power differential between this white woman who stood between her and getting her narrative published and Harriet Jacobs. So Child, for instance, persuaded her to omit an entire chapter about John Brown's insurrection. And you can imagine how Child would feel about that, right? You don't want to upset your readers. If you put a chapter in there about this insurrectionist who did kill some white people in Virginia and had all of these radical views, you're going to lose some of your white readers, especially your women readers, which would have been, I think, Jacob's target audience. So they went back and forth, and the evidence from Child's letters is a little ambiguous, how much she actually changed, how much Jacobs controlled what she changed. And so there's a real sort of sinking feeling that you get, I think, reading this, that here we have another example of a white woman taking over a Black woman's story and controlling it in a way. Jacobs had lost control of her narrative in so many ways, and here it was going to happen again. There's an incredibly ironic coda to this story, which is that it's possible that Child convinced Harriet Jacobs to publish the book pseudonymously. It may have been Jacobs' idea, we don't know, but anyway, Jacobs' name was not on the book, but Child's name was, because she wrote the introduction. And after they both died, the fact that Harriet Jacobs actually existed faded from the historical record. And people began to believe that this was a novel written by Child. And so even if that had never been her intention, the upshot was that she had indeed taken over this Black woman's story. And it took incredible scholarship in the 20th century, so not just a couple of decades ago, for people to uncover that Harriet Jacobs actually did exist. She lived in Edenton, North Carolina. We now know who her enslaver was. We know all of the characters in the story. And there's amazing scholarship about this question, to what extent we need to hold Child accountable for having interfered in Jacob's story, while at the same time acknowledging that we would probably never know the story if it weren't for her. So it's another, for me, it was a very hard chapter for me to write, I have to say, because the moral complexities of it are very vexing. But I just think, my hope is that everyone will read Harriet Jacobs' memoir, and I also encourage people to read the amazing scholarship around it, because it exhibits to us some of the best thinking about the intersection of power dynamics, racial, gender, class, all of these different things, and the way we inherit those problems in really now, and also in protest movements now. So that's a long-winded way of saying that there are some really complicated ways in which I think Child can help us think about exactly those questions.
So yeah, Harriet Jacobs' incidents in the life of a slave girl, and the real person who really existed, happens to have been buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, and you can pay your respects there. So, well, just one more question before we take some questions from the audience or from the Zoom listeners, wherever you are. A narrative strand that runs through this book, and we heard brief reference to it, is the marriage of Maria Francis to David Child, which was a long, complicated story, and I think maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. Pique the curiosity
Yes.
of your readers.
The love story part of the book, yes. It was a very complicated marriage I find, a sort of refreshing way. I mean, which is to say, she didn't paper over the conflicts in her marriage. So he was a wonderful person. He was more progressive than she was in many ways. She said he was wide awake before she was, both on racial issues and on gender issues. He loved her mind. As far as I know, there's no evidence that he ever stood in her way or ever tried to talk her out of forging into writing in male spheres like economics and politics and history. But he was a walking financial disaster. He was an idealist, and his schemes were very expensive. And the most interesting one, just very briefly, is that he decided to try farming sugar beets in an attempt to undermine the plantation cane sugar trade. So the idea was, if the expansion of slavery depended on demand for sugar, if you could get people to use beet sugar instead of cane sugar, you could undermine the slave economy, and then slavery would end. Long story short, that sounds like a crazy idea to you. It was. They went bankrupt. And she, after 15 years of funneling all of her literary assets into his schemes, and at another point there were several very bad things going on in her life at this point, including that she'd had a split with some of her allies in the abolitionist movement. They separated for about 10 years and lived apart, and she just said to him, essentially, I am not going to follow your schemes anymore. If you ever want to come home, there's a place for you here. He went off and did all kinds of other schemes for a while, and then finally did return. And they lived the last couple decades of their life very happily together in Wayland, Massachusetts. And the first time I read something that she wrote as a widow, talking about how he was the best husband any woman ever had, I definitely rolled my eyes. I thought, she's just forgotten. I'm sure the problems continued, but I actually think she was right. I think he did change when he came back. He accepted that she had to control the checkbook, and they managed to just live out the rest of their lives supporting each other intellectually, even though she always had to support him financially.
Great. Well, we're happy to have questions, and Gavin has a microphone for anyone who's going to put their hand up.
My mind is just going crazy with, I have 1,000, but I keep on, Anyway, what did you think of, my mind, here's it. I think that she's a prodigy in a way of her thinking, and she's ahead of her time. So what do you think with your classes, because you're saying that you have a morality philosophy class, and can you tell me where that is, where you teach about your students? Have they ever said anything to stump you, or have you maybe even converted with your philosophy of ethics about this story?
Yes, Colby College is the answer to that. I teach at Colby. I think that I have started talking about her in my moral philosophy classes because she's such a good example of someone who doesn't always get it right, but you can try to track the way she's reasoning morally in ways that really resonate. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example, but I think like one thing that I always tell my students at the end of the semester is I want them to leave my class haunted. I want them to leave being a little less sure that they're on the right side of history. I know that sounds really cruel as a teacher, but I guess when I teach moral philosophy, I don't ever want the assumption to be we come in and we talk about how bad other people are. We really try to look at the way we behave and the ways in which we probably contribute to the very problems that we're condemning. And that's something I think Child was really good at doing. She knew that she was imperfect. She at one point said something like, in what ways am I contributing to the problems that I abhor? I'm sure I am. May God forgive me. There was a kind of fierce humility. Like she wanted to exhibit to her fellow Northerners especially that she was willing to say that we're not getting things right. And I really admire that. So I try to model that, and I try to help them think in those ways as well, sometimes using her example. Thank you for the question.
I enjoyed your talk, thank you. I'm wondering about her religion and David's. I wonder if religion has anything to do with a person's ability to see the better side. And not just her and her husband, but the abolitionists in general. Because I know Emerson was very late coming around. Thoreau seemed better. I don't know about the other transcendentalists, but just in general, has religion helped at all?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that it was true that many abolitionists that she associated with, especially William Lloyd Garrison, really relied on their Christian faith as a way of supporting their social justice work. And she really wasn't one of those. She grew up as a kind of Calvinist and then converted, believe it or not, to Swedenborgianism. I can't believe I just said that. Which is this amazingly bizarre religion that is also sort of mystical. It has to do with a great unity where everything is connected and this world is just a kind of veil that we can't see reality, and when we die, that veil will be lifted and we'll see truth as it is. She didn't stay in that church, in part because her minister, her Swedenborgian minister, was an anti-abolitionist. So she left that church and she never joined another church. She did go to the Unitarian Church in Wayland regularly. And she was a great admirer of Jesus. So she would talk about his message of peace and nonviolence. But I think she remained, for most of her life, fairly bitter about the ways in which the church had defended slavery, especially during her time in Boston, and the way they had actively got in the way, especially of women participating in the abolitionist movement. So I would not count her as among the abolitionists who had religion as their sort of core response to their social justice. Thank you.
Hi, you talked about this incredibly vivid response to the first book that she wrote against slavery. You know, she was almost, the way you described it, they were almost run out of town. And it's maybe because I haven't read the book, so I don't know what happened next, but I guess I'm wondering from the point of view of this question about that was raised about morality, whether she ever woke up and said, "Why did I do that?" In other words, the cost in her early life of that intervention, the loss of all her readers, the loss of the magazine.
Yeah.
If you could say a little bit about the effect of that on her, and what did she ever kind of say, "Uh-oh," or did she go on, or how did she go on after that?
Thank you. Well, to my mind, she's refreshingly honest about that. So she was very clear. She would sometimes say things like, "I regret nothing." You know, I'm so glad that I saw the light when I did, and I never would have wanted it to be any other way. But she was also very clear that it was hard. It was decades of ostracism. One historian has said something like, these abolitionists, they were prepared for a quick martyrdom. They were not really prepared for decades of ostracism. And so it was true that many of them, Child included, had to withdraw from the cause occasionally just to try to regroup, and I think it's really humbling to think that white abolitionists were able to do that much more than black abolitionists, who couldn't just blend into the anonymity of New York or Boston streets, but faced discrimination always. People like Sarah Mapps Douglas or Marianne Shadd Carey, who just didn't have the luxury of saying, actually, this is harder than I thought. I think I'll back off for a while. So Child did take breaks that she then really regretted, and then she would throw herself back into activism. So I would say the 1840s and into the 1850s, she had a really dormant period. But then around the time of the Kansas-Nebraska conflict and then John Brown's raid, she really reignites and is very involved all the way through the war and beyond. So I would say she didn't regret it, but she was also very clear that she did pay a high price. She was also always very conscious that whatever price she paid paled in comparison to what free black Americans were suffering and, of course, enslaved black Americans as well.
Peter asks, did she ever meet Lincoln or have an opinion about Lincoln?
Oh, she had opinions about Lincoln, yes. She was very happy when he was elected and then bitterly, bitterly disappointed when he did not use the power that she saw him as having to emancipate enslaved people immediately. Some of the angriest letters in her entire, she has a massive correspondence. Some of her angriest letters are about Lincoln. She fantasizes about a bomb going off in the White House. She wishes that somebody would, his neck looks perfect for hanging, she says at one point. Yeah, she just couldn't bear it after 3 decades of everything, to the previous question, that she had sacrificed and that other people were still suffering, and she felt like Lincoln had the power to do it and he wouldn't do it, and she wrote this open letter to him in a newspaper where she just excoriates him, and at the end she says something like, if you are willing to have this power and not use it, may God forgive you. It will require infinite mercy to do so. And then she did, I think, later come to see that he was playing a much longer and more complicated game than she was aware of. She hated politics, so of course she hated that he was doing these very complicated negotiations. By the time he was reelected, she was very relieved and very happy. And when he died, she said she mourned for 5 minutes and then thought, well, maybe this is God's way or the universe's way of removing him because he would have been too conciliatory with returning Confederates. And then she put her hopes in Andrew Johnson, which of course were bitterly disappointed. So I think she appreciated him more. At the end, I'll tell you one more thing she said about him that always makes me laugh. She says, in the end, he was a better president than Americans deserved.
We have a question from Susan who asked, did she participate in the women's rights movement?
Yes, so there's a whole other chapter of her life that I could talk about that has to do with her support of women's rights, especially towards the end of her life. So she always said that she was more comfortable advocating for other people's rights than for her own. She wrote a 2-volume history of women in the 1830s that just tried to document how women were treated across different nations and civilizations. But she didn't come to any really clear convictions about what should happen with women's rights, the way the evil of slavery sort of hit her like a thunderbolt. And she suffered enormously in the split in the abolitionist movement when there were more conservative abolitionists didn't want women to participate. That was the birth of many women's rights advocates like the Grimke sisters and some Abby Kelly, for instance. But then at the end of her life, when there was advocacy for women's suffrage, she did write a lot, published many articles in the Independent arguing, again, just trying to get rid of all of the bad arguments that people were using to keep from giving women the vote. But when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton decided to oppose the 15th Amendment, when it became clear that the 15th Amendment would grant black men the right to vote, but not women. So once that became clear, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony decided to oppose it. And at that point, Child broke with them and sided with people like Lucy Stone, who supported the 15th Amendment, and were disappointed, obviously, that women were not included in the 15th Amendment, but did feel like black suffrage for men was more important at that point.
Oh, question in the back.
Let's see. Carl asks, what was your greatest revelation related to Child's life?
It may have been the moment when I was reading a letter that she wrote very late in her life, when she was, maybe within a year of dying, and she was physically failing and physically weakened and really annoyed by that, and said something like, I can't wait to get out of this body because I think there is more work for me to do in the universe. And that was a moment where it became clear that she thought of herself as existing beyond her physical life, and also wanted to think of herself as living on, as her words as living on. And I think that was a moment where I was just sort of, let me put it this way, what a Protestant work ethic, right? She's looking forward to dying so she can keep working. Not a quiet quitter, we could also say about Lydia Maria Child. So just that sense of the depth of her commitment, that she was looking forward to dying so that she could continue working, that struck me.
So Lydia, that makes me want to ask you about your own further work. You were inspired to write a biography and to really step out of the familiar territory of philosophy. Are you going to keep going in that vein? Do you know?
I hope so. I am definitely bitten by the biography bug. I think Hegel can take care of himself at this point, is my general stance on that. And I think there are so many other figures like this that I would like to work more on. There's someone that I'm co-editing a volume with that's a more academic volume, but it's 19th century women philosophers in the United States and Great Britain. And we're discovering amazing women, including women of color who were definitely philosophizing, but would never have been described as such. And they lived incredible lives, and I would love to continue bringing their lives to readers.
Well, I want to thank you, and I hope everyone here will consider buying a book, which we have for sale in the lobby. And thank you again for a wonderful conversation.